I'm not entirely sure who came up with the plan, but by the end of the day, we had settled on the destination and the date. Although I'd been camping many times before, I was fairly certain neither Sam nor Danny had. They had come into the family later, after my real father had passed away. He was the one who had loved camping. My stepfather, however, wasn't as keen on the outdoors. Don't get me wrong, he's a wonderful man, but nature was never his thing. We made a detailed list of all the supplies we needed for the trip and followed it precisely, including the 4 cases of beer, which might have been the most important item. Everything was packed and ready for us to leave at sunrise the next day. As we set off, none of us could have imagined what was ahead of us or how it would change the bond between us. Something we had once thought to be unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was quiet and uneventful. I was happy to see how dry the area was. While making a fire wasn't a problem for me, I knew it wasn't exactly a strength of mine. Plus, I knew neither of my brothers had experience with anything beyond lighting a cigarette. Just to be safe, I brought along some lighter fluid, though I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Sam and Danny, using some skills they had picked up from YouTube, struggled with setting up the tent. I had chosen the simplest tent I could find, yet it still took them nearly an hour. By the time they joined me, the fire was roaring. I had buried the potatoes in the coals and prepped the steaks, already well into my second beer by then. The steaks were cooked quickly, and by the time it was dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping experience began. I had deliberately chosen a remote location because I knew we'd get loud and obnoxious once we got drunk, and I liked making big bonfires and playing my music loud. You can't do that with other campers nearby. That evening turned out to be a blast. We went through 2 cases of beer and didn't crash until dawn. It was something I'd needed for a long time, and despite the hangover, I made up my mind that we were going to do this more often. By the time I dragged myself out of my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Sam and Danny were already awake, sitting by the dead fire with beers in hand. They looked pleased to see me. I asked what had happened to the fire, and Sam mumbled something about not being able to get it going, which made me laugh. I grabbed an armful of wood from the tree line and dropped it onto the cold coals, blowing on them until they flared up. Within minutes, the fire was roaring again. I went to the stream to fetch some water, and when I got back, Sam's jaw had dropped, and Danny looked like he was dying to ask how I did it. As I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a big mess of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with some coffee. After eating, I felt much better and suggested we go fishing. We didn't return to camp until almost dark, and unfortunately, none of us had caught anything worth keeping. But Sam had clearly caught a good buzz. I grilled the leftover steak, and we set to finishing what remained of the beer. This night was much quieter than the last. I didn't want to build a big fire, knowing it would be harder to fully extinguish before we headed home. We spent most of the night talking about random stuff, work, girls. Around 2 a.m., we decided to turn in. The beer was long gone, and my last memory was Sam heading out of the tent to relieve himself. He'd had way more to drink than Danny or I, and I remember him stumbling a few times trying to get out of his sleeping bag. He eventually made it out, and I must have passed out shortly after. The next thing I remember, the sun was starting to peek through the trees, and I had to pee. I unzipped the tent carefully, trying not to wake the others. As soon as I opened the tent, I was hit by a strange, burning smell, like charred meat. I figured one of the guys was already up and trying to cook breakfast. Looking back, only Danny was still asleep, so I assumed Sam was the one at the fire. I crawled out, expecting to tease Sam about his cooking, but what I saw was far more shocking. The fire had gone out, and Sam was nowhere to be seen. The light was still dim, but there was a large, unmoving object lying across the dead coals. I walked closer and was hit full force by the burning smell. That's when I realized what I was looking at: Sam, lying face down in the remnants of the fire. He wasn't moving. Without thinking, I grabbed him and rolled him over. His skin was blackened, and the smell was overwhelming. I started yelling for Danny, but when he didn't respond right away, I ran back to the tent and shook him awake. He resisted at first, but when I shouted that Sam was dead, he bolted upright and demanded I repeat myself. All I could do was point toward the fire and the horrible scene that was becoming clearer with the rising sun. Danny flew out of the tent and almost came face to face with Sam's charred body that I stood behind him, silent, my eyes closed. Danny collapsed to his knees and started wailing. In that moment, I wished I could be anywhere else. The combination of the smell and the sound of Danny's sobs was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. A cold breeze hit me, and that's when I realized I had wet myself. It didn't matter. I couldn't bear to open my eyes and see Sam like that again, that I crawled back into the tent and started crying. And I stayed there for who knows how long until I finally decided I should call for help. The authorities arrived about an hour and a half later. When the coroner took Sam's body away, I finally gathered the strength to come back out. Danny was speaking with one of the officers, and the smell was still so strong that I started retching and went back inside the tent. Another officer joined me inside the tent, and we talked about the trip and the events of the night before, though nothing significant stood out. He left about 20 minutes later, and the remaining officers soon followed. Danny and I began breaking down camp in silence. I worked quickly, desperate to get away from the awful stench of my brother's burned flesh. Looking back, I might have seemed cold and uncaring, but I was the oldest, and it was my responsibility to inform the rest of the family. I knew telling our mother would be devastating, and I wanted to do it before she heard it from anyone else. Mom had always dreamed of a big family, and when my father died, she thought that dream was over. But when she met my stepfather and they discussed adoption, she was thrilled. Sam and Danny were biological brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens when she adopted them. Older kids are usually harder to adopt, but she had fallen in love with them immediately. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of our family that I in the weeks following Sam's death. I started noticing that Danny seemed suspicious of me. He didn't say anything outright, but I caught him giving me strange looks more than once. As more and more questions about Sam's death arose, I began to wonder what had really happened that night. I had always assumed Sam had either passed out or tripped and fallen into the fire. He was far more intoxicated than we were. But when the medical examiner's report came back, some things didn't add up. For example, Sam's back was covered in bruises, which could be explained by the fact that he had played rugby for years. But his skull was also fractured, a worrying sign. Though the doctors admitted it could have happened due to the fire, as extreme heat can cause a skull to crack, it still raised doubts in Danny's mind. He seemed convinced that I had something to do with Sam's death. I, too, had my own suspicions about Danny's relationship with Sam. I'd seen them argue more than once, only for them to stop as soon as I entered the room. But now wasn't the time for the family to fall apart. Our mother needed us more than ever. If she sensed the growing distrust between us, it would break her heart, maybe even destroy her. For now, I'm determined to bring us back together, for Mom's sake, and perhaps for Sam's too. I'll keep digging into what really happened between the two brothers that night, even if it leads to an awful truth none of us want to face. After all, Sam was my brother too. I owe it to him. Growing up wasn't easy. Instead of constant physical harm, although that did happen, it was mostly my parents ignoring me. They both had problems with drinking. My mom worked part-time, claiming she wanted to be around for me, but in reality, she spent most of her time either passed out or drinking. My dad, who was a long-haul trucker, was barely ever home, leaving me to fend for myself. We lived in a small house on the outskirts of a town, with a huge forest stretching out behind it. From as early as I can remember, I was captivated by those woods. Before long, I spent most of my days exploring them, finding peace there. I realized pretty quickly that neither of my parents noticed when I came or went, so I started staying out in the forest overnight, just to see if they'd miss me. Of course, they didn't. Soon, I was spending weeks camping out deep in the woods. But all good things eventually end, and one morning, after a long stretch of being away, my dad caught me sneaking back home. He had just returned from a trip, and it was early, around 5 a.m. on a school day. When he saw his 13-year-old son walking out of the woods, he was furious. He punished me, and I got yelled at by both of them. But that didn't stop me from going back. After laying low for a while, I waited until my dad was gone and my mom was drunk again. Once she was out, I slipped back into the forest. Every morning, I'd sneak back into the house before school without being noticed. My life went back to how it was. If I wasn't in school, I was wandering the woods. I had a few spots where I'd camp. Early on, I figured out I wasn't the only one who had found refuge there. Homeless people would camp there, drinking and staying away from the public eye. One time, I made the mistake of staying in the same place for too long and was almost attacked by one of them. After that, I moved my camps across the river, away from them. Some nights, I would watch them from the shadows as they drank and fought. Seeing their destruction only deepened my resentment. It reminded me too much of what I had to deal with at home. As time went on, I moved further into the forest, always searching for new places to explore. By summer, more homeless people had arrived. They set up their camps throughout the woods, but I stayed safe by keeping to my side of the river, which only I knew how to cross easily. One sweltering summer day, while getting water from the river, I heard voices in the distance. I kept my guard up. After filling my canteen, I was heading back when I saw a group arguing on the other side. I hid to watch. There was a makeshift tent, and next to it, 3 men and a woman were shouting at each other. They were too far away for me to hear everything clearly, but they were clearly drunk, flailing their arms as they yelled. I stayed hidden for about 10 minutes, just watching. Then, one of the men smashed a bottle over another man's head. The guy fell and didn't move. Then, the first man picked up a large rock and slammed it into the man's head over and over. The others just stood there watching. He did it 3 times before he was too tired to continue. I had to hold in my screams, terrified and unable to move. The woman screamed something and slapped the man who had done it, but he just stood there, staring at the body. After a few minutes, they all ran off. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too scared to move in case they came back. Eventually, I convinced myself they weren't returning. I expected the man on the ground to get up, but he didn't. For some reason, I thought I needed to help him. Even though he was just a homeless drunk, he was still human. I sprinted the 3 miles back home. When I got there, I was relieved to see my dad was home. I ran inside, breathless, and shouted for my parents. They were sitting on the couch, and I started telling them what I'd seen. My dad snapped at me to shut up, then asked what had happened. When I told him, instead of helping, he started yelling at me for being out in the woods. My mom, slurring her words, joined in, and they both tore into me. The worst part was when my mom accused me of making it all up for attention. I denied it, but she wouldn't listen. The conversation ended the way it always did, with my dad pulling off his belt and hitting me until I cried. I cried myself to sleep that night, like so many nights before. Afterward, I wasn't allowed out of the house without one of my parents, so my time in the woods was over. Not long after, they sent me to live with my grandfather, saying they couldn't handle me anymore. I expected life to be worse there, thinking maybe my mother's issues had come from him, but I was wrong. Grandpa Joe turned out to be the most kind and patient man I'd ever met. He was the first adult to ever ask me what I liked to do. No one had ever cared to know. I nervously told him about my love for nature, expecting him to laugh, but instead, his eyes lit up. He spent the next hour telling me stories about his own camping trips. I realized then how lucky I was. As soon as spring came, we spent all our time hiking and exploring different parks and forests. Grandpa Joe taught me everything he knew about nature, and that knowledge has shaped my life. Even though he's too old now to go hiking with me, I still visit him and tell him all about my adventures. His body might be frail, but his mind is as sharp as ever. I owe him more than I could ever repay, just for loving me. Took me years to finally tell him the story about the woods. I also told him how guilty I felt for not saying anything sooner. He hugged me, and when I asked him what I should do, he told me to contact the police. He said once I told them, it wasn't my burden anymore. So I did, and the weight of that guilt lifted. Years later, while I was in college, Grandpa Joe told me the police had found the people responsible. Most of them had died, but the woman had led the detectives to the man's body. They thanked me for helping solve the case after all that time. With that, I put that dark chapter behind me until recently when my dad died, bringing all those memories back. But now, as an adult, I see things more clearly. My love for the wilderness has become my career, traveling the world to protect the natural places I once escaped to. Without Grandpa Joe, none of this would have been possible. In the summer months, from late June to early August, a camp in the northeastern U.S. comes to life. It's a sleepaway camp, with staff and kids arriving every Sunday afternoon and leaving Friday night. Throughout the week, everyone stays in cabins scattered around the grounds, cut off from the outside world. The camp spans several acres and includes a large dining hall, various other buildings, and vast stretches of beautiful natural scenery. There are open fields, forests, a large pond filled with fish, and a stunning ravine. The property feels completely isolated, hidden away from any major roads with only a long, private driveway leading in. Technology is largely banned for campers, while staff can only use devices during breaks. No computers, no cars, and limited communication with the outside world. The staff relies on walkie-talkies to stay connected across the sprawling campgrounds. I spent a decade there as a camper and worked as staff for 4 more years. This place holds a special spot in my heart, but it also has a long history of strange and unexplained events. I could fill a book with all the eerie stories I've heard and personally experienced during those summers. I'd like to give you a glimpse into what it's like as a staff member and share some of the more chilling encounters I had between 2014 and 2018, during the time I worked as a counselor, aged 16 to 20. Most of the strange events occurred at night, especially during training week, and generally affected the camp staff more than the campers. Campers rarely came into contact with the odd occurrences, and I can't explain why. As a child, I never felt scared there, but as an adult, some experiences left me on edge. During training week or after the campers went to sleep, counselors often relaxed outside the dining hall, gazing up at the stars. We had an open view of the sky, which allowed us to spot strange lights moving in odd patterns. Unexplained flashes, unexpected meteor showers, and mysterious red lights would appear in the sky. Some of the older counselors, who knew a lot about astronomy, were often baffled by what we saw. Nightmares were common among the staff. Many had recurring dreams of figures standing at the foot of their beds or lurking in the corners of their cabins. I had such dreams almost every summer, waking up in a sweat, only to find the cabin silent and the campers peacefully asleep. Other common occurrences included hearing voices and footsteps in the night, items disappearing and reappearing in strange places, and doors mysteriously unlocking. Counselors often arrived as skeptics but left believing there was something unexplainable about the camp. My first encounter with the paranormal was in 2014, my first year as a counselor. There was an old, flat gravestone near the pool, just outside the girls' cabins. It was so worn that the name and dates were unreadable, but it was clear it marked a grave. No one knew how long it had been there or why. By the end of that summer, the gravestone had been removed, and we were told not to talk about it. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still buried there, and removing the stone didn't stop the strange happenings. The older staff told stories of two famous ghosts. One was a boy seen running across the camp's recreation field. The legend went that he had been hit by a car while chasing a ball and now haunted the camp. The second was a woman in white, who could be seen standing on the porch of a house near the camp, staring toward the camp at night before disappearing by morning. Though those stories frightened us, a more experienced counselor later showed me the shadows that made the boy and woman look real. An electrical box's shadow resembled a small child, and a large American flag looked like a woman in the breeze. While these were just illusions, there were other things at camp that weren't so easily explained. One of the most unsettling places at camp was an old building called Day Camp. It used to be a house, and it stood alone, separated from the other camp buildings by a stretch of woods. The building gave off a deeply unnerving feeling. Whenever I was inside, it felt as though someone or something was always watching me. The building was far from the main part of the camp, and at night, its dark wooden exterior blended into the forest. Sometimes, after the day campers left, the building would be closed and locked, but later that night, the lights inside would be found on again, even though no one had been in there. More than once, counselors had to walk through the dark woods to turn the lights off, swearing they'd never do it again. In 2016, I had an especially creepy experience during a missing camper drill, which was done to practice locating a child if one ever ran away. During the drill, I was assigned to check the day camp building. As I walked through the silent rooms, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. After searching the building and finding nothing, I headed back outside. Just as I passed the cellar doors, I saw that they were wide open, with a light shining from inside. A place I didn't even know had a light. That night, a friend had a similarly eerie experience at another part of camp, where a door rattled violently even though no one was inside. In 2017, I was promoted to a program specialist and ended up running activities in day camp again. This time, I had a close friend with me who was sensitive to paranormal activity. He confirmed my suspicions about the building, but reassured me that the spirits there weren't harmful. Over time, I grew more comfortable in day camp, though I could never fully relax. Though there are many more stories I could share, I'll stop here for now. Despite the strange happenings, nothing at the camp ever tried to hurt us. The spirits seemed to just want to be remembered and talked about. The camp is full of history, and I believe the spirits are simply a part of its identity. This place has seen generations of campers, and I'm certain that's why it holds onto so much energy. Though eerie, I respect the mysteries of that camp, and those who visit it quickly learn to do the same. The arguments always began the same way. You'll never catch me dead in a national park filled with nothing but overweight tourists in RVs from the new generation, and I like it just the way it is. Referring to him as old-fashioned was putting it mildly. If it wasn't made of canvas or leather, he deemed it modern junk. My mom tried several times to introduce things like nylon tents, but he refused. He'd rather lug around that giant, musty wall tent everywhere we camped. And don't even get me started on the leaky cans of kerosene that spilled over everything. He was definitely a man born in the wrong era. The term roughing it could have been invented for him. We endured his outdated way of enjoying nature until my younger brother's near-death experience changed his mind. Throughout the early 80s, my dad would take us to the national forest during Thanksgiving. The weather was mild for that time of year, and the woods were beautiful. I can still smell the pine trees. These trips always seemed to line up with hunting season for some reason. I recall hearing that Dad used to hunt before he met Mom. I think she had forbidden him from doing it anymore. Maybe this was his way of rebelling against her. Either way, gunshots near our camp became a normal sound. Our parents grew up with little supervision, so it didn't seem unusual to let my brother Mike and me roam the woods by ourselves. No one thought it might be dangerous to have two boys playing in the forest with so many hunters around. We'd leave camp at dawn, play until lunchtime, and head back out until dinner. We'd been doing this for as long as I could remember, and no one thought twice about it. One particular Thanksgiving, we'd been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was when G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were super popular, and Mike and I loved dressing up in camouflage and playing war. Mike's birthday had been a few days earlier, and he had just gotten a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were cheap, but we adored them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't recall exactly what I was doing, but I knew Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree when suddenly I heard a loud bang, followed by a whistling sound near my head. I dropped flat to the ground, unsure of what was happening. Something told me to stay still. About 30 seconds later, I heard faint moaning in the distance. Mike was nowhere in sight, so I called him on the walkie-talkie, no answer. Then I heard what sounded like my name. I called again, but still no response. Now I was getting scared. Unsure of what to do, I yelled out that the game was over and he needed to answer me. I didn't know if he was still trying to prank me or if something was seriously wrong. I listened carefully, but only heard the faint rustling of leaves. I walked toward the sound, but when I called out again, all I heard was another moan. I ran about 20 yards and stopped. The rustling came again, this time much closer. I dropped to my stomach and scanned the ground. About 3 feet away, I saw the bottom of a shoe. It had to be Mike's. I rushed over, and the sight that met me still haunts me to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with fear in his eyes. Just under his arm, there was a gaping wound with blood pouring out. I was in shock, but did my best to stay calm. I didn't want to scare him more than he already was. Had I been older, I might have known better how to move him, but I just picked him up and carried him as far as I could. He was too heavy for me, but I was determined to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had to set him down. Mike must have been in terrible pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice was so weak, I nearly broke down. Somehow, I held it together and ran all the way back to camp. Mom must have sensed something was wrong because she immediately called for Dad. He rushed out, took one look at me, and asked, "How bad is it?" I was too out of breath to speak, so I just pointed in the direction where I had left Mike. Dad took off running. By the time I caught up, Dad was already carrying Mike back to camp. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Mom kept talking to Mike, urging him to hang on. I sat in the back, pressing my shirt against the wound. What normally would have been a 30-minute drive took us just under 20. Dad handed Mike off to the doctors, who rushed him into surgery within the hour. The next few hours felt like a living nightmare. I was in shock over what had happened, but I was amazed at how calm my parents seemed. Now that I'm a parent myself, I realize they were far from calm. They were just handling the situation as best they could. It was after midnight when the doctor finally came to give us an update. Mike had been in critical condition for a while and had technically died more than once during surgery, but he now had a good chance of fully recovering. The police arrived the next morning to question us. I broke down several times while recounting the events. That was the first time I really grasped how close I had come to being shot as well. Mike stayed in the hospital for a few weeks, and my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think Dad considered staying at the campsite, but after a brief conversation with Mom, he decided against it. The detectives kept us updated, but even by the time Mike was discharged, no one had been connected to the shooting. The leading theory was that a poacher had mistaken Mike's movement for a deer. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Mike made a full recovery and eventually went on to build his own business and family. Something good did come from that terrible event. We never went back to the national forest. Even better, Dad realized that camping with all those tourists in RVs was a safer option for our family. Between the ages of 12 and 17, I spent holidays in places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. That's the kind of camping I always envisioned, peaceful and quiet, and I'm pretty sure Mike would agree. This was around 2002 when an old buddy of mine invited me to join him for a camping trip. I hadn't been camping since I was about 14, so I agreed, excited by the idea. The entire week leading up to it, I could barely sleep from the anticipation. My friend picked me up a little after 5 a.m., and we drove nearly 90 miles to the park. I managed to catch some sleep on the way, so I felt a bit more energized when we arrived. That's when my friend dropped the news on me. We still had to hike 2 more hours to reach the campsite. I tried to persuade him to pick one that was closer, but he insisted I would love the spot once we got there. Reluctantly, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't too bad. Most of it was downhill, but as time passed, I started feeling more and more exhausted. Halfway there, we took a short break, but soon enough, we were back on the trail. The second half was much tougher, mostly uphill, and before long I was dragging my feet and losing focus. When we finally reached a flat area, I felt relieved. My friend, who was ahead, somehow missed the trap, but I didn't. One moment I was walking, and the next I was on the ground. Hitting the bottom of the pit shocked me awake, and a rush of adrenaline masked most of the pain. When I tried to stand, my right leg gave way, and I collapsed onto a sharpened stick sticking up from the ground. There were more stakes at the bottom, but luckily, they had been knocked over. When I glanced down, I saw the bone in my shin sticking out. Instinctively, I pulled the stick out of my leg, which only intensified the pain, leaving me more nauseated than before. I looked up and saw nothing but blue sky bordered by trees. The pit seemed about 8 feet deep, and I couldn't help but think the fools who dug it must have spent days working on it. I shouted for my friend, and soon enough, his laughing face appeared above me. He didn't know how bad my injury was at first, but when I told him, the laughter turned into panic. I asked him what had happened, and he said it looked like some hunters had dug a pit trap, and I had fallen into it. I assumed he could just reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. Next, he tried to extend a tree branch down to me. It worked for a moment, but when I tried to stand, the pain was unbearable. There was no way I could put weight on my right leg. It became clear that I wasn't getting out without help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't too worried. I could hear my friend pacing above me, clearly freaking out. Trying to stay calm, I told him to go get help from the ranger station, which was about an hour's walk from where we had come. He could easily make it back before dark. After he left, I was alone with nothing but the pain. Waves of it came over me, and the nausea didn't make things any easier. At one point, I thought about trying to make a splint, but when I attempted to tighten it, I almost passed out. I decided it was best to leave it alone and sat with my head between my knees until the dizziness subsided. After a while, I tried to distract myself by singing, but that only worked for a bit. Then I heard thunder and noticed the sky above growing darker. I figured a little rain wouldn't hurt, but I should have considered the situation more carefully. At first, the rain was light, but soon, it was pouring down in sheets. I was fine until I noticed water starting to fill the pit. My feet were already submerged before I realized the trouble I was in. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, as best as I could manage, and prayed the rain would stop. As the minutes dragged on, more of my body disappeared into the rising water. After about an hour, the storm finally eased up, and I could relax a little. The water had only reached halfway up to my shins, and I figured if it kept up at that rate, help would arrive before the water got any higher. Unfortunately, the rain soon returned with a vengeance. On the bright side, the rain took my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to stay positive by thinking of funny movies and jokes. The next hour felt like the longest of my life. By the time help finally arrived, the rain had almost stopped. The ropes they lowered down pulled me out just as the water reached just below my waist. The thought of nearly drowning in a small pit in the middle of nowhere still haunts me. Once I was out, the ride to the hospital went by quickly. After surgery to place some screws and plates in my leg, I was discharged to recover at home. The next 8 weeks on crutches were tough, but I was just grateful to be alive, broken leg and all. We never did make up for the camping trip, but in the years since, I've taken my kids camping a few times. Thinking about it now, maybe it's time to give my friend a call. We haven't caught up in years, and another camping trip might be just what we need, though I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time. A little ways from the town where I grew up, there's a forest with many camping spots. A few years back, I went to visit my family for a week and thought I'd go camping while I was there. My gear was pretty simple, but I wasn't aiming for anything extreme. I just wanted to find a nice spot to camp for a night or two. I started on a random trail and followed it for a while. I knew most of the paths led to a pond a few miles in, so I expected to end up there. However, as I reached about 5 or 6 miles in, I realized I was headed somewhere different. I was actually curious to see where it would take me, but after hours of walking, it felt like the trail was endless and leading to nowhere. Eventually, my legs were tiring, so I found a small clearing off the side of the path to set up for the night. It was getting dark, and I hurried to get everything ready and start a campfire. I barely had a few minutes before the forest was completely dark. The campfire lit up a decent area around me, but not enough for me to venture more than 15 or 20 feet away from my camp. I sat there, boiled some water, and made tea to relax for the night. It was hard to tell the time, but after about an hour, it was well into the night when I heard footsteps coming down the trail. At first, I thought it might be an animal like a bear, but as they got closer, I realized it was definitely a person. I listened as they walked, and their figure became slightly visible in the firelight. I was just far enough from the trail that I couldn't see them clearly, but I noticed they were tall and carrying a backpack. They didn't stop. They just walked past my campsite, and when the sound of their footsteps faded, I thought it was odd that they weren't using a flashlight and were hiking so late. However, seeing the large backpack, I figured they knew what they were doing, and that was the last I thought of it. I stayed by the fire for another hour, then waited for it to die down before getting into my tent to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but I couldn't get comfortable after waking up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, walking about 20 feet from my campsite. After I finished, I turned to go back, but far off on the other side of my tent, I saw something move. The moonlight wasn't bright enough for me to see clearly, but I instinctively knew it was a person. I slowly walked back to my tent, my eyes wide, scanning the trees around my camp. I carefully reached in and grabbed my backpack, pulling out a flashlight. When I turned it on, it revealed a person standing by the trail, looking just like the figure I'd seen earlier. But just as quickly as I spotted them, they dashed behind the trees, and everything went silent again. I probably sat there for a minute with the flashlight before realizing there was nothing I could do but leave as quickly as possible. I packed up what I could, leaving my cheap tent behind, and started walking toward the trail. When I reached the spot where I'd last seen them, I felt even more terrified because there were no signs of them anywhere. I didn't know if they were watching me or even following me. I kept my flashlight on, cautiously moving down the path, shining it around the trees. Halfway through my walk, the sun started to rise, and I was able to make it back safely. Once I got home, I looked up the trail I took and discovered it wasn't even an established path. So maybe it was someone like me, just exploring. But that didn't explain what had happened. Why had they been near my camp in the middle of the night, and how long had they been there? I think that night was probably supposed to be my last, and leaving when I did was likely the only way I could escape. I was hiking along a trail I had come across in a remote part of a national forest. It was a round-trip route that usually takes about 3 days to reach the end, and another 3 days to return. I didn't know too much about how well-known the trail was, but usually on these longer hikes, it doesn't matter because you rarely meet many people. On the third day of my hike, I passed a campsite where I saw a man sitting near his tent. I decided to take a break, and we chatted for a while. He mentioned he was staying the night and planned to hike to the highest point of the trail the next day. I told him I was heading there that same day and might see him later. After a short chat, I continued on my way and eventually reached the spot where I planned to camp for 2 nights. The view was breathtaking, unlike anything I had seen before, and it made for an amazing rest day at the trail's summit. The entire day passed, and no one came by. When night fell, I realized I was still the only one camping at the site. I thought back to the man I had met the day before, who said he would be reaching this point today, but he never arrived. I figured maybe he decided to turn back or stay another day at his previous campsite. The next morning, I packed my things and began the hike back, but I started a bit later than planned. I hoped to at least make it back to the campsite where I had met the man. For some reason, I was feeling unusually sore, and the day was quickly fading. Soon, I was hiking in the dark with my headlamp on, making my way down the trail for about an hour after sunset. Eventually, I reached the camp, and the man's tent was still there, set up just like before. Considering his plan to continue hiking and the fact that staying in one spot for several days while backpacking is uncommon, I called out to see if he was okay. There was no reply. I walked closer and mentioned that I just wanted to check on him, but the flap of his tent was slightly open, and no one was inside. A feeling of dread washed over me. I stood still, looking around, but saw no trace of him, until I noticed a faint light in the distance. It was a dim glow, barely visible, deep in the woods. I decided to approach, walking about 40 yards from the tents before I found the source. A headlamp lying on the ground, almost out of battery. As I bent down to pick it up, I realized someone was watching me. They were standing just 10 yards away, partially hidden and clearly trying to avoid being seen. I instantly felt that this wasn't the man I had met earlier, but I couldn't ignore the situation. "Hello? Do you need help?" I called out. The figure remained silent and motionless. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," I said nervously, then hurried back to the tent. Luckily, I hadn't unpacked anything yet, so I quickly grabbed my gear and began leaving the campsite. As I walked away, I saw the light in the woods go out. I kept moving and didn't stop until I had hiked another 3 miles to the next campsite. The next morning, I reported what had happened. Sadly, my fears were confirmed. The man I had met was now considered missing. There were almost no clues to follow, and in such a remote area, searching for someone is nearly impossible. Whoever I saw that night remains a mystery, but they might hold the key to what truly happened. Most of us, though, have a pretty good idea of what likely occurred. Earlier this year, I went camping in the woods, about 5 hours south of my home. There was a small pond I often visited. It wasn't well known, so it was always peaceful and quiet, the perfect retreat. On the first day, I arrived and set up camp. The place was deserted, just as I expected. The pond wasn't too big and had a sandy shore, surrounded by thick forest, allowing a clear view all around. Shortly after I settled in, I saw a man come out from the trees on the opposite side. He set up his tent and for a while kept to himself, seeming like an ordinary camper. But before sundown, he began walking around the pond towards my campsite. He greeted me with a friendly smile and introduced himself as John. He mentioned he wasn't sure if I noticed him setting up earlier, but he saw me and thought it would be nice to say hello, given how remote the location was. We talked for a bit, and John turned out to be a great guy. He was 28, close to my age, and we both appreciated the solitude of the spot. After chatting for about half an hour, he returned to his camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night was quiet, and nothing unusual happened. The next morning, we hung out together. He had brought some beers, and we spent most of the day by the water having casual conversations. It felt like I had found the perfect camping buddy. Later that evening, after we parted ways to our separate camps, I sat by my campfire, feeling grateful for meeting John. He seemed like someone I could enjoy camping with again. As the night grew darker, I prepared to put out the fire and head to bed. That's when I noticed John walking around the pond again. His campfire had been out for a while, so I assumed he'd already gone to sleep. But here he was, coming toward me. He approached the fire, and something felt off about him. "Everything all right?" I asked. He smiled, returning to his usual friendly self, and said he'd found a cool spot with an amazing view. He invited me to check it out, and though I hesitated, he insisted it was even better at night. His enthusiasm made it hard to refuse, and I figured, why not? It's not every day you get to see such a view while camping in the woods. I followed him around the pond and into the forest. There was no trail, but John navigated the dark woods as if he'd been here many times before. We walked for about 20 minutes before he slowed down and pointed ahead with a grin. I looked ahead and saw an old, rusted trailer, half consumed by nature. Moss had overtaken it, and the metal siding was riddled with holes. I turned back to John, confused, but his face was different, cold and expressionless. "What is this?" I asked, but he didn't respond. A wave of fear rushed over me, and as I scanned the area, I heard the creaking of the trailer door opening behind me. I barely glimpsed someone stepping out before I bolted. I could hear John and the other person chasing me, but I ran as hard as I could. I kept running through the woods until I lost them. By then, I was so far away that I didn't know where I was. I wandered through the forest until daylight, eventually finding my way back to the pond. From the tree-line, I saw my campsite, but everything was gone. It looked like no one had ever been there. I stayed hidden, made my way back to the trail, and hiked to my car. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they never found anything. Honestly, I don't think they really looked. I still don't know what was planned for me that night, but I'm grateful I escaped before finding out. I worked the late shift at a small inn on the outskirts of a quiet village. It's a place where not much happens, and the only sounds at night are the hum of the vending machine and the occasional car driving by on the nearby road. The stillness is something I've grown accustomed to, and I usually find comfort in the silence when the rest of the world seems asleep. But recently, something strange has been happening during my shifts. It all began about a week ago. I was sitting at the front desk, flipping through an old newspaper, when the phone rang. I glanced at the clock. It was close to 3 a.m., an unusual time for someone to call. I picked up the phone and answered, "Front desk, how can I assist you?" But there was no response. Instead, I heard a strange sound, like heavy breathing coming from the other end. I waited for a moment, thinking someone might have accidentally called, but the breathing continued. It was slow and steady, almost like a pattern, but something felt wrong about it. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The breathing suddenly stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps, as if someone was walking across a wooden floor. Then, just as quickly as it began, the line went silent. I hung up the phone, feeling uneasy, but brushed it off. Prank calls aren't uncommon, especially late at night. Maybe it was just a bored teen trying to spook me. The next night, the phone rang again around the same time. This time, there was no breathing, but I could hear faint whispers, soft and unintelligible, like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. My heart raced as I listened, trying to catch any words, but the whispers were too low, too far away. Then, the footsteps came again, louder and louder, until it felt like they were right beside me. Quickly hung up, my hands shaking. I checked the inn's log to see if any guests had checked in that night, but the only occupied rooms were the ones I already knew about. The other rooms were supposed to be empty, but when I looked at the phone's display, it showed that the call had come from one of those vacant rooms, room 104. My stomach turned. For the next few nights, the calls continued, and each time the sounds were different. Sometimes it was the creak of a door opening. Other times, I heard the faint melody of a music box playing a haunting tune. But the calls always came from a different empty room, and every time I checked the rooms afterward, I found nothing unusual. The beds were made, the lights were off, but something always felt slightly out of place. A chair moved a bit, a curtain drawn too far. Little things that didn't seem right. By the end of the week, I was on edge. Every time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat, and I braced myself for whatever unsettling sound would come through the receiver. I began dreading my long, lonely shifts, fearing what might happen next. One night, after another call from an empty room, I decided to investigate. I had to figure out where these calls were coming from. I grabbed the master key from the desk and made my way to the room that had just called, room 204. My footsteps echoed in the silent hallway as I approached the door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the knob before I finally unlocked it and pushed the door open. The room was dark and cold. I switched on the light, and the small lamp on the nightstand cast an eerie glow across the room. At first glance, everything appeared normal, but as I looked closer, I noticed something odd. The phone on the nightstand was slightly off the hook, just enough to disrupt the line. I felt a chill as I reached out to hang it up properly. Then, I noticed a slip of paper peeking out from under the phone. I unfolded it and found a list of names I didn't recognize. At the bottom, in red ink, was a single word, help. I backed out of the room, my mind racing. I knew I had to speak to the inn's owner, Mr. Howard, about what was happening. Maybe he could explain the strange calls and why they seemed to come from rooms that should be empty. The next evening, when he arrived, I told him about the calls, the noises, and the strange things I'd found. For a brief moment, he looked surprised, his face pale, but he quickly composed himself. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice calm but distant. "Probably just some old wiring issues. I'll handle it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping something from me. That night, I couldn't concentrate. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, wondering what he wasn't telling me. Then, just as my shift was ending, the phone rang one last time. I answered it, my hand trembling. At first, the line was silent, but then I heard a faint, familiar voice. Mr. Howard's voice. It was coming from a room that wasn't supposed to be in use, a room at the far end of the hallway that I had never seen anyone enter or leave. Room 303. I dropped the phone and bolted out of the inn, not stopping until I was outside under the moonlight. I never went back to that inn. Whatever was happening in those rooms was far darker than I could ever comprehend. Years ago, I used to hitchhike often. I started in my early 20s trying to save money while traveling. I liked meeting new people and hearing their stories. Most of the time, the rides were friendly and uneventful, but one night, I had an experience that still haunts me. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was standing on the side of a desolate road. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep shade of purple. I'd been waiting for nearly an hour, and the cold was starting to seep into my bones. The road was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. I was beginning to think I might have to spend the night outside when I saw the headlights of an approaching car. It was an old, dark sedan that slowed down and pulled over. I hurried to the passenger door and looked inside. The driver was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a tired face. He seemed harmless enough, so I got in. "Where are you headed?" he asked in a gravelly voice. I told him the name of the town I was trying to reach, about 50 miles away. He nodded and said he was going that way. "Thanks," I said, grateful for the ride. The first few minutes of the ride were silent, the only sound coming from the engine and the tires on the road. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur by, but something about the man made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me from the corner of his eye or how tightly he gripped the steering wheel. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something felt off. As we drove, I noticed a large box in the back seat. It was covered with a thick, dark blanket and took up most of the space. I hadn't seen it when I first got in because it was pushed down low, almost hidden from view. Now that I'd noticed it, I couldn't stop staring. It was an odd thing to have in the back seat, and I wondered what might be inside. The man must have noticed me looking because he cleared his throat. "Just some old stuff," he said, his voice tense. I nodded, not wanting to pry, but my curiosity grew. What kind of old stuff would someone hide in a box that big? His strange behavior only made me more suspicious. A few more miles passed in silence, and the air inside the car felt heavy. I started to feel claustrophobic. I shifted in my seat, trying to get comfortable, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, I heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from the back seat. At first, I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again. It sounded like something, or someone, was inside the box. I turned to the man, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hear what?" he replied, his tone flat. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I thought I heard something from the back seat," I said. "Just the road noise," he answered. "Nothing to worry about." But I was worried. My heart was racing, and I could feel sweat forming on the back of my neck. The muffled sounds from the box grew louder, and I started to panic. I glanced at the door handle, my mind racing. We were on an empty stretch of road with no other cars in sight. If I jumped out, I could get hurt, or worse, but staying didn't feel safe either. As I weighed my options, the man started humming a low, eerie tune that sent chills through me. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and the humming grew louder and more frantic. I knew I had to do something. I reached for my phone, trying to be discreet, but the man saw me. His eyes flashed with anger, and he grabbed my wrist. "No phones," he hissed. I pulled my hand away, my heart pounding. The car was still moving, and the strange sounds from the back seat were growing louder. I was 19, working as a burger delivery driver to help cover my tuition fees. The job wasn't thrilling, but it was simple and the tips were decent enough. Most nights were uneventful, just me driving around delivering orders and listening to my favorite tracks. But one night was different, one that would stick with me forever. It started just like any other shift. I picked up a few orders and loaded them into my car, a beat-up old hatchback that had definitely seen better days. The weather was calm, and the streets were nearly empty, making for an easy drive. As I turned onto a long stretch of road, I noticed something strange in the distance. A vehicle was speeding toward me, but its headlights were off. The car was barely visible, just a dark blur speeding ahead. My heart skipped as I realized how fast it was coming. I swerved sharply to the right, barely avoiding a collision. The car shot past, still without its headlights, and disappeared into the night. My hands trembled, but I continued driving, telling myself it was just a reckless driver. A few hours later, I had another delivery. This time, the address was in a quiet suburb, with narrow roads and older houses lined closely together. I parked outside the house, grabbed the food, and walked to the front door. As I waited for someone to answer, I heard an engine idling behind me. I turned around and saw the same car from earlier parked across the street. The headlights were on this time, but the car remained still, engine humming. A chill crept up my spine. The door opened behind me, and I handed over the burger, trying to stay calm, but my mind kept focusing on that car. After the transaction, I walked back to my car, glancing over my shoulder. The other vehicle hadn't moved, but I could feel someone watching me. As I got into my car and turned the key, the other car suddenly roared to life. It sped toward me, stopping just inches from my front bumper. The driver, a bald man with a menacing expression, leaned out of the window. His eyes were cold, filled with something unsettling, anger or something worse. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice dripping with malice. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, frozen. The man seemed to take my silence as defiance. "Think you're tough, huh?" he growled. "Think you can cut me off?" Before I could say anything, he slammed his hand on the side of his car, the loud bang echoing in the quiet street. The shock snapped me out of my daze. I threw my car into gear and sped off, heart racing, but he wasn't done yet. His car screeched as he floored the gas, chasing after me. The narrow street felt like it was closing in as I tried to escape. I took sharp turns, weaving through side roads and alleys, desperate to lose him. But he stayed close, relentless. The chase felt endless. My hands were slippery with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles turning white. I could hear his engine growling behind me, his headlights inching closer in the rearview mirror. I wasn't familiar with these streets, but I used every ounce of driving skill I had to stay ahead, dodging parked cars and tight corners. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw an open area ahead, a small park with a looping road. I made a hard turn into the loop and, as soon as I was out of sight, switched off my lights and pulled over behind some bushes. I held my breath as his car zoomed past, unaware that I had tricked him. I stayed hidden in the dark, trying to calm my pounding heart. I didn't move for a while, afraid he might come back. Eventually, the roar of his engine faded, leaving only the sound of crickets in the distance. I didn't see the car again for the rest of that night, but the fear lingered. Every corner I turned, I half expected to see those headlights or hear the growl of that engine behind me. I finished my deliveries, but I was on edge, scanning the road constantly. A few nights later, while on another delivery, I spotted the car again. It was parked at the end of a neighborhood, partially hidden in the shadows. My stomach tightened as I drove past, praying he wouldn't notice me. But as soon as I passed, the car pulled out and began following me. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the road, but my mind was racing. I needed to lose him, but the streets were empty, and there was no one I could ask for help. As I pulled up to my next stop, I saw a man waiting on the porch for his order. Desperation took over. I rushed to him, practically shoving the food into his hands. "Please," I whispered, glancing back at the car. "Can you help me?" His eyes widened, taking in my panic. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and grabbed his phone. I noticed the car parked at the far end of the street, the driver watching us closely. I felt trapped, like prey caught in a snare. The man spoke to the police, giving them our location while I stood there, trying to hide my fear. It felt like ages before I heard the distant wail of sirens. As soon as the sound reached us, the car at the end of the street roared to life, tires screeching as it sped away into the night. When the police arrived, I explained everything, but the man was long gone. They searched the area but found nothing. They reassured me they would keep an eye out, but I knew he was still out there somewhere watching. After that night, the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I got behind the wheel, I was on high alert, scanning the roads for that car, for that man. I never saw him again, but the fear lingered. The memory of those headlights, of that wild chase through the narrow streets, stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I came to something terrifying. I once worked long hours in a cramped, airless office, staring at a computer screen until my eyes stung. Weekends were my only escape, and I'd head out to the hills to breathe fresh air and find some peace. Hiking was my favorite, especially in thick woods where city noises couldn't reach. The forest was my refuge, a place to clear my mind and feel alive. One weekend, I decided to try a new trail a friend had mentioned. It was supposed to be tough and rarely used, just right for someone like me who preferred solitude. The weather was cool, and the sky clear when I reached the trailhead. I packed enough gear for the day, feeling sure I could handle whatever came my way. The trail wound through dense trees and rocky paths, growing more beautiful the deeper I went. Felt like I'd stepped into another world. I didn't see a single hiker, and the quiet was eerie, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves or a distant bird call. After hours of hiking, I reached a fork in the trail. One path was clearly marked, while the other led into a darker, thicker part of the woods, where light barely filtered through the trees. My curiosity got the best of me, and I took the unmarked path. I figured I'd explore it for a little while, then turn back. But the trail quickly became more difficult, and soon it disappeared completely. I should have turned back then, but the sense of adventure kept me moving forward. I didn't realize how far off course I was until it was too late. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken, and panic set in. I was lost. I had no idea which way to go. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same in the fading light. The trees, once comforting, now felt like they were closing in on me. I walked for what felt like hours, calling out in the hope someone might hear me. But there was no answer. My legs grew weary, and I knew I had to find shelter for the night. Just when I was about to give up, I saw something through the trees. A small cabin hidden deep in the forest. Relief washed over me as I approached, thinking I'd found help. The cabin looked old, its wood weathered and the roof sagging, but it was shelter. I saw a faint light through the window, likely from a fire. I knocked on the door, hoping for a kind soul who would let me stay for the night. The door creaked open, and an old man stood there. He looked rough, with wild hair and a beard that reached his chest. His clothes were ragged, and his eyes were sharp, like a trapped animal's. He didn't speak at first, just stared at me as if he hadn't seen another person in years. "Please," I said. "I'm lost and need help." Finally, he spoke in a raspy voice. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This place isn't for you. Leave now while you can." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I was too tired to leave. "I don't know where to go," I pleaded. "Please, let me stay here just for tonight." He shook his head slowly. "If you stay, you won't make it out. This is my territory, and I don't like strangers." Despite his warning, I was desperate. I thanked him and decided to set up camp near the cabin instead. I found a small clearing not far away, pitched my tent, and lit a small fire. The night was unsettlingly quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I eventually drifted off to sleep, only to wake in the early morning with a creeping sense of unease. When I crawled out of my tent, I noticed something strange. The trees around my campsite had carvings on their trunks. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen, and they filled me with a deep sense of dread. As I tried to make sense of them, I saw movement in the distance. The old man standing among the trees watching me. He was too far away for me to see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, like a shadow at the edge of the woods, always in my peripheral vision no matter which way I turned. Fear gnawed at me, and I quickly packed up my things, eager to leave. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, like prey being stalked by a predator. The carved symbols grew more frequent, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I tried to run, but the forest twisted and turned, confusing me. Every time I thought I'd gained some distance, the old man appeared again, always watching from the edge of the trees. My mind raced, desperate to find a way out, but it was no use. I was trapped in his domain, and the forest was on his side. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't going to escape. He had warned me, and I had ignored him. Now I was paying the price. As the sun set, I knew my time was almost up. The carvings, the old man, the silence, it was all too much. Exhausted and hopeless, I collapsed, unable to continue. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the old man standing over me, his wild eyes gleaming in the fading light. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what was coming. I had entered his world, and I would never leave. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more eerie stories, and don't forget to share them with your friends and family. We appreciate your support. I live by myself in a small cabin on the outskirts of the village. It's a peaceful place with only a handful of homes nearby. Most evenings, I relish the quiet. It helps me unwind after a busy day. But one evening, the quiet took on a different tone, something unsettling. It was a Thursday night, and I had just returned from work. The air was chilly, and a light rain had left everything damp and dreary. I shut the front door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and wandered into the kitchen to fix a simple meal. I wasn't expecting anyone, so my plan was to spend the night watching some TV and maybe reading a bit after dinner. After eating, I curled up on the couch, wrapping a blanket around myself. I flipped through the channels but couldn't find anything appealing, so I settled on a movie I'd seen dozens of times before. It was comforting to know what would happen next. Halfway through the film, I started feeling drowsy. My eyelids grew heavy, and I began to drift off. But just as I was on the verge of sleep, I heard a noise. It was soft at first, just a faint scratching sound, like something brushing against the side of the house. I figured it might be the wind or maybe a tree branch against the wall. But then I heard it again, this time closer, near the window. I sat up, now wide awake, my heart pounding. The sound continued, slow and deliberate. It no longer seemed like the wind. I muted the TV, and the silence in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. Then I heard the noise again, near the back door. That's when I realized someone was trying to get in. I froze on the couch, unsure of what to do. I didn't have any weapons, and my phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, too far to reach without making a sound. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just an animal, I tried to convince myself. Then the scratching stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. I held my breath, straining to hear any noise. Suddenly, the handle on the back door rattled. Someone was definitely trying to break in. Fear gripped me as I quietly slipped off the couch. I moved slowly, careful not to make any noise, and crept toward the kitchen to grab my phone. I knew I had to call for help, but I was terrified that making any sound would alert whoever was outside. As I reached the kitchen, I heard the door creak open. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't locked the back door when I got home. I cursed myself for the mistake. I grabbed my phone and crouched behind the kitchen counter, my hands trembling as I dialed for emergency services. I could hear footsteps entering the house. Slow, steady, and deliberate. They were inside. When the operator answered, I didn't dare say a word. I could only listen as the intruder moved through the house, checking each room. The footsteps grew louder, heading toward the kitchen. I whispered my location to the operator, my voice barely audible, and hung up, praying the police would arrive quickly. The footsteps stopped right outside the kitchen, and I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't find me. But then, the intruder stepped into the kitchen. I saw their shadow on the floor, moving closer to where I was hiding. I knew I couldn't just stay there and wait to be found. My eyes scanned the room for anything I could use to defend myself. I spotted a heavy skillet on the stove and carefully reached for it, trying to be as silent as possible. Just as I grabbed the handle, the intruder rounded the corner and saw me. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw a menacing look in his eyes. He was a tall man, wearing dark clothes with a hood covering his head. He looked dangerous, like someone who wouldn't think twice about hurting me. Without hesitating, I swung the skillet as hard as I could. It made contact with a loud thud, and the man stumbled back, clutching his head. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I bolted out of the kitchen and ran toward the front door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock, panic surging through me. Behind me, I could hear the man getting up, his footsteps growing faster and angrier. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and flung it open. I ran outside into the cold night, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I glanced back, expecting to see him following me, but the street was empty. The house stood there, dark and quiet, as though nothing had happened. Moments later, I heard sirens in the distance. The police arrived and searched the house, but the intruder was gone. They told me I was lucky to have escaped unharmed, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt shaken, violated, and terrified. That night changed everything. The peacefulness I once loved about living alone had turned into a constant reminder of how vulnerable I was. And now, every small sound made my heart race, fearing that the intruder might come back. It felt like just another regular Sunday, or so I thought when I woke up that morning. Little did I know that by the end of the day, I'd have a story so strange. I still struggle to make sense of it as I write this. The day started off simply enough. My partner Sam, my close friend Jordan, and I were hanging out, bored out of our minds, scrolling through our phones without much interest. That's when Sam had an idea. Hey, how about we go for a hike? It's been forever since we hit the old trail. The trail Sam was referring to wasn't just any path. It was a well-known hike that led to a large rock hanging over a cliff, offering a stunning view of the nearby town. It was breathtaking and, while a bit of a challenge, the route itself was straightforward. I'd walked it countless times, even after dark, following the local New Year's fireworks show. Jordan immediately perked up at the suggestion, her eyes bright with excitement. "That sounds awesome, let's go," she said. And just like that, we decided to go. We quickly gathered the essentials: water, flashlights, and some snacks before heading out. The trail wasn't far from where we were, so we walked to the start. The sun was already sinking in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as we arrived at the trailhead. The light had that golden, beautiful quality to it, but was fading quickly, so we knew we didn't have much daylight left. Still, the path was familiar and we were confident in our memory of it. As we hiked, the beauty of the trail was just as I remembered. The trees created a lush canopy above us, with beams of sunlight filtering through, illuminating the forest floor. We were all in good spirits, chatting and laughing as we made our way along the well-worn route. But as we continued, the light started to disappear faster than expected. We soon reached a long, straight stretch of the trail, which seemed to go on forever. We were making good progress, but with darkness closing in, we all agreed it wasn't worth the risk of tackling the steep part in the dark. "Let's head back," Sam suggested, and Jordan and I readily agreed. We switched on our flashlights and started the trek back. At first, everything felt normal. The trail was just as I remembered it, which was a comforting thought as the forest grew darker. But then, as we approached a clearing where the trees opened up, revealing a view of the entire downtown area, something felt off. This spot had always been my favorite, looking down at the twinkling city lights as night fell. But tonight, the city below seemed wrong. "Does the city look strange to anyone else?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sam was the first to respond. "It feels like we're looking at it backwards," he said, confusion creeping into his voice. Jordan nodded, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced with unease. I thought it was just me. I didn't want to say anything. We lingered there for a moment, trying to shake the strange feeling that something was very wrong. But with night fully setting in and a long walk ahead, we reluctantly turned away from the unsettling view. As we walked deeper into the forest, everything around us began to feel different. The path, which I thought I knew so well, started to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. My heart began to race, a mix of fear and confusion clouding my mind. "We're just tired," Jordan tried to reassure us, though her voice was a little too high-pitched to be convincing. But this wasn't just exhaustion. The once familiar trail now felt like it was playing tricks on us, leading us in circles. Familiar markers were gone, replaced by an eerie sensation of being watched. Then, the trail itself changed beneath our feet. The ground felt rougher, wilder, as if no one had walked this way in years. "This isn't right," Sam muttered, stopping suddenly. "We should have hit the main road by now." Panic began to set in as we tried to retrace our steps, only to find that the path we had come from had somehow vanished. The trees loomed larger around us, their branches reaching out like claws, and the air seemed heavy with an unsettling presence. That's when we found the clearing. It wasn't the one with the city view, it was something completely different, something that felt out of place. In the middle of the woods, hidden away, was a door in the ground. It was old, rusted, like the entrance to an abandoned mine or a bunker. Around the door were white chairs, arranged in a circle, each with a piece of white cloth draped over it. No signs of a campfire, no footprints, just the chairs silently sitting there. "What is this place?" Jordan whispered, her flashlight flickering over the strange scene. We didn't know it then, but we were about to make a choice that would haunt us. Our curiosity overpowered our fear, and we moved toward the door, drawn in by the mystery of it. It was a mistake. Each step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was watching us. The silence was suffocating, and we realized we had to leave. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't seem to escape. Every path we took led us back to that eerie clearing, to the door and the chairs. It was as if the woods were shifting around us, keeping us trapped. Our phones were useless, and our calls for help vanished into the night. Panic gripped us as the reality of our situation sank in. Were we stuck here, caught in an endless loop? And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it ended. The path cleared, and we stumbled back onto the familiar road. The cool night air had never felt so sweet, but the relief was short-lived. What had happened in those woods? Why had it happened to us? The experience left us shaken, with more questions than answers. Once home, Sam checked his phone to call our families and let them know we were safe. That's when we noticed something strange. His photo gallery had over 1,000 new pictures, all taken at the exact time we were lost, 10:32 p.m. But instead of actual images, the photos were just bursts of white. It didn't make sense. Sam had been using his phone as a flashlight the entire time, not the camera. The next day, we talked about going back to the woods to find that door, those chairs, anything to explain what had happened. But it took us a full year to gather the courage to return. When we finally did, the woods felt ordinary again. There was no sign of the door or the chairs. Instead, we found a rusted old meat grinder in a clearing, another strange relic that didn't belong. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened that night. Was it a shared hallucination? Could there have been something in the air? But nothing makes sense, especially not the photos on Sam's phone. The experience has left me with a lingering fear of the woods. What was once a place of peace and adventure now fills me with dread. I've shared our story online, hoping to find others who have experienced something similar. Yet, no matter how much we talk about it, we never find any answers. That night changed something in us. We made it out of the woods, but a part of us is still trapped there, lost in that strange and twisted place. The woods are no longer just trees and trails to me. They're a mystery, one I'm not sure I ever want to solve. My friends and I had been living in the lively center of Los Angeles, a city full of energy, but we were longing for an adventure away from the urban sprawl. We decided to go on a road trip that would take us into the wild landscapes of Canada, circling around Lake Erie and then heading back home through the picturesque routes of northern Pennsylvania. I guess we were searching for some literal fresh air. You see, I'm from Argentina, a country rich in culture, history, and beautiful scenery. But since I moved to the US for business school with my friends Megan, Sarah, and Chloe, I had been eager to explore more of this continent's natural beauty. Though I always had a spirit for adventure thanks to my days in a hiking club back home, my friends were more used to city life. Yet their excitement for this trip was contagious, and we were all buzzing with energy. The plan was straightforward, or so we thought. Rent a car, pack the essentials, and hit the open road, enjoying the kind of freedom you usually only read about in books. The excitement was real as we planned our route, talked about the places we'd visit, and imagined the memories we'd create. Little did we know, our adventure was about to take an unexpected turn, giving us a story we'd never forget. The drive was long but beautiful, filled with laughter, sing-alongs, and endless conversations about everything and nothing. As the city skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror, we were welcomed by the wide, green landscapes of the countryside. In those moments, with the wind blowing through the open windows and the world ahead of us, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in a long time. However, as the sun began to set and we neared our stop for the night, a secluded cabin deep in the forests of northern Pennsylvania, a sense of unease began to set in. The cabin, which had been described as a charming nature retreat, was about 30 minutes outside of Scranton, or so we thought. Our excitement started to dim as nightfall arrived, and the reality of our isolated spot in the woods became clear. Navigating the muddy forest roads without cell service became difficult, and we had to rely on an old map we found in the car. I could sense the tension among us rising, especially when we came across a perfectly set-up campfire in the middle of the woods with no one around. It was eerie, to say the least, and a stark reminder of how far we were from the busy streets of Los Angeles. After some wrong turns and growing nervousness, we finally arrived at the cabin. It was just as described, old, made of rough logs, and completely without modern comforts like electricity or running water. The idea of spending the night in such a remote place began to sink in, but we tried to make the best of it. With my limited wilderness experience, I teamed up with Megan to take charge. We used our phone flashlights to explore the cabin, hoping to find some lanterns or firewood. Unfortunately, the rain had soaked most of the wood, and starting a fire seemed nearly impossible. The cabin had its own charm, though, and as we gathered around to cook some pasta, we embraced the rustic experience. As the evening wore on, our spirits lifted a bit. Sarah and Chloe worked on getting the beds ready and making sure the windows were tightly shut to keep out the cold. It almost felt cozy in a strange, adventurous way. But as night closed in, so did a sense of unease I couldn't shake. That's when Sarah, one of the city girls, came over to me with a serious look. She quietly mentioned that she'd seen an old cemetery while we were driving and, even more unsettling, had spotted someone or something moving near it. At first, I wanted to laugh it off. We were here to get away from the stress of school, not scare ourselves with ghost stories. But the look in her eyes told me she wasn't joking. I assured her I would lock all the doors before we went to bed. But deep down, I felt a growing sense of anxiety. After a simple meal and some failed attempts at making s'mores on the stovetop, the others headed to the loft for bed. Meanwhile, I found myself drawn outside, feeling the need to be alone with nature for a while. Sitting on the porch with my last beer in hand, I let the quiet settle in. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain and the distant babble of a nearby stream. It was peaceful, a world away from the hustle of LA. But then, as I scanned the dark forest with my flashlight, an unsettling feeling crept over me. Suddenly, a loud roar pierced the night, unlike anything I had ever heard before. My mind scrambled to figure out what it was, but nothing came close. Not from my experiences in Argentina, nor anything I had heard about American wildlife. It wasn't a bear, that much I knew. Then I saw it, a figure tall and dark, standing at the edge of the trees. Its eyes reflected the light from my flashlight, glowing eerily in the darkness. The figure was massive, far taller than me at 6 feet 2 inches. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as we locked eyes, and then it disappeared into the woods with another roar. Fear shot through me, and I raced back into the cabin, locking the doors and pulling every curtain closed. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with thoughts of what I had just seen. Was it a trick of the light? Some kind of wild animal? Or something else entirely? The stories of strange creatures in the woods, stories I had always dismissed, suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But even as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The first light of morning brought a sense of relief, though the memory of the night's events lingered. I decided not to tell the others about the figure I'd seen. It seemed unnecessary to scare them when they were already so excited about the day ahead. We had breakfast together, the mood light and happy, as though the previous night's fears had disappeared with the darkness. As we packed up and drove back towards the city, we reflected on the beauty of Canada, the fun we'd had circling Lake Erie, and the unique experience of staying in that old cabin. But my thoughts were elsewhere, still fixated on the strange figure I had seen in the woods. Back in the comfort of the city, the memory of that night began to fade, but it never completely left me. I couldn't help but search the internet for answers, scrolling through forums and articles about strange sightings in the forests of Pennsylvania. Could it have been a bear or something else entirely? I found no clear answers, only more questions. In the end, I decided to share my story here, hoping that someone out there might have experienced something similar. Perhaps they could help me understand what I saw, or at least reassure me that I wasn't alone in my experience. One thing is certain, that night changed me. It reminded me that the world is full of mysteries, both beautiful and terrifying, and it left me with a story I'll never forget. The news hit me like a runaway train. Last spring, While I was on the other side of the globe, my brother Luke vanished without a trace during a backpacking trip with his friends. Luke had just turned 19, and I, already entrenched in adulthood, had let life and its countless distractions pull us apart. I was busy making my own way in the world while he was off, doing who knows what. It wasn't supposed to turn out this way. We had sworn to stay close after our mom passed away, but that promise, like the silence between us, grew heavier as the years went by. I was in Asia when it happened, completely wrapped up in my new job and oblivious to what was happening back home. Easter was supposed to be our reunion, a chance to patch up our strained relationship. Instead, I returned to find an empty spot at the table and a silence that screamed his absence. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked, the words echoing in the cold, familiar air of our childhood house. "The police didn't have your current number?" my aunt mumbled, avoiding my eyes. "And his friends? They thought he was with you." A pit of guilt formed in my stomach, gnawing away at me. I had been so consumed with my own life, I didn't notice when Luke's texts and calls became less frequent. I assumed he was just busy, like I was. It never occurred to me that his silence was unintentional. Determined to find out what had happened, I asked around. His friends' stories didn't add up. They said he left the campsite in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and never returned. Each of them described a different spot for the campsite, and their vague recollections made it obvious they were hiding something. I was frustrated, but it only made me more determined to uncover the truth. I went to the police for help but was met with indifference. "We'll investigate when the weather clears," they said, as if it wasn't urgent. Felt like I was on my own, fighting a growing fear. Winter dragged on, and with it, my anxiety intensified. The snow made search efforts impossible, and Luke's friends, now avoiding me altogether, threatened legal action if I pressed further. When spring finally arrived, I got the call I had been dreading. A man searching for gold along the river had found something far worse: small, unmistakable human bones. The weeks that followed brought more grim discoveries: part of a skull, ribs, and a haunting silence from the authorities. They ruled it a tragic accident, but the bones told a different story. They showed signs of violence, something far more sinister than nature could explain. I should have been there for him. After our mom died, I promised to look out for Luke, to be the one person he could rely on. Instead, I was half a world away when he needed me the most. That guilt stayed with me, a shadow I couldn't escape. I quit my job, left everything behind, and returned home, determined to find out what really happened to my brother. The truth had been buried under layers of lies, and I was prepared to dig it up, no matter the cost. The day I decided to confront his friends was bitterly clear, the sky too bright, mocking my grief. I tracked down one of them, Ryan, at a local cafe. He saw me coming, his eyes darting nervously. "Tell me what really happened that night," I demanded, sitting across from him. His hands shook as he held his coffee. "It's like we told the cops," he stammered. "He went to the bathroom and never came back." But I knew their stories didn't match up. Each one had described the campsite differently, and none of the spots they mentioned had been searched. When I pressed him, Ryan's facade broke. "We didn't notice he was gone until morning," he admitted. "We were scared, okay?" Their fear had twisted the truth, turning them into enemies instead of allies in the search for Luke. As the snow thawed and spring brought warmer days, more of his remains were uncovered. Bones that painted a picture of something far worse than an accidental death. The police wanted to close the case, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. The scratches on the bones, the way they were scattered, it wasn't the work of animals. There was something deliberate about it. I had failed Luke, and now I was determined not to fail him again. I had to find the answers that everyone else seemed willing to ignore. The small town near the forest where Luke had disappeared was cloaked in silence, the kind that suggested everyone knew more than they let on. I started asking questions, beginning with the local diner. The waitress, a kind woman in her 50s, leaned in as she served me pie. "People around here don't go into those woods," she whispered. "Bad things happen." Determined to learn more, I went to the ranger station. The ranger, a gruff older man named Jack, looked at me with a mix of pity and frustration. "Some things are better left alone," he said. When I insisted, he reluctantly handed me a map, pointing out the last known location of Luke's campsite. "Be careful," he warned. "The forest doesn't always give back what it takes." Rumors led me to an old cabin deep in the woods, a place the locals called Thornridge Cabin. The legend said a tragedy had happened there years ago, and the place had been cursed ever since. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my growing fear, I made my way there. The cabin was as eerie as the stories suggested, abandoned and decaying, like it had been forgotten by time. Inside, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. A silver bracelet, one that I had given to Luke for his birthday. He had been here. Night fell quickly, and with it came the sounds of the forest. Rustling leaves, cracking branches, and something else, something unnatural. A low growl filled the air, and before I knew it, I was face to face with a creature that defied explanation. A twisted fusion of man and beast. I fought for my life, barely managing to survive. The next day, I left the woods, but I knew this wasn't over. I had seen too much, and the questions that haunted me about Luke, about the creature, were just beginning.